All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh here, closing in on the end of another year, folks. DM Radio turns 17 years old in this coming February. So it doesn't feel like we've been doing it for that long, but we have. And although many things change, many things do stay the same. Data literacy is as important today as it ever has been. And we have an expert who's going to talk about that today on the show. We have Doug Llewellyn. He is the CEO of the Data Society. We're going to find out what that is and what they're doing and what they're working on. So, Doug, I'm very pleased to have you on the show here. I think that what you're doing sounds fantastic. And you just mentioned before the show a little bit about the background of the company. It sounds pretty interesting and very focused. And that's what you want, certainly in the entrepreneurial universe. You want to be focused on accomplishing specific objectives. So, tell us a bit about the Data Society, where the idea came from, and what you guys are working on.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. So thanks for having me on the show. So the Data Society Group right now is a platform made up of four companies, really around the investment thesis of playing at the intersection of data and people. So what does that really mean when you think about it? And if you take a half a step back, there's so much data in the world, and people have spent millions of dollars, companies have spent millions of dollars on databases and technologies and clean data and security around data. They don't always spend a lot of money training their people to how to effectively use data. And that's where we come in. So if you think about a large Fortune 1000 company or a large government organization, they're going to have a chief data officer, a chief learning officer, people who are really focused on making sure that the employees in their organization can access data, can use data, can analyze data, and really, have the data help them make better business decisions. And so we think about the chief data officer and chief learning officer at the core of who we serve, and we serve them in two ways. We have workforce sort of culture, change management, and workforce development, where we come in and we do um, train the trainer programs where we help bring data culture and data literacy programs to large companies, all the way down to once those programs are in place, what are the specific skills employees need? Whether that is a generally non-technical employee, maybe a marketing analyst who needs to use data more effectively, all the way up to data scientists and data engineers. We have R and Python training and different things like that. And so really, from the top of the ecosystem, data culture and change management into data literacy programs, all the way down to specific skills training. And then the other half of our business is really focused on communities for data leaders and data practitioners.
Hmm.
So CDO Magazine, which we bought at the end of September in 2023, runs a series of large and small events all year, really bringing data leaders together to share best practices, talk about pain points, talk about solutions to those pain points, meet technology vendors, et cetera. So we really think about serving those serving those audiences in two very different ways. And then our business learns from each other, right? So everything that we learn in the classroom helps us more effectively bring content and thought leadership to those data leaders. And everything we hear at our conferences, on stage, and networking events helps us more effectively put together curriculum for those students at the companies and government organizations.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And I'll throw kind of a curveball question at you here.
Sure.
I think one of the biggest challenges you've got to be facing right now is how fast things are changing, how rapid the evolution is in the data world. Of course, there's tremendous focus on Gen AI, which is
hmm
generative and therefore probabilistic and therefore not deterministic. And of course, what we want in the data world is typically deterministic. We want to know, what is the data point? What is the data that represents this reality in our business or that reality? And Gen AI has come along as this really powerful technology that can be a co-pilot, for example, for coding, that can be very useful for drafting marketing language and
hmm
content to promote things. But again, it is probabilistic, and in data, we want to be deterministic. How are you, how is that affecting your plans, what you're teaching, what you're seeing out there in the marketplace? Or, do you think maybe I'm overstating the disruption that we're facing right now?
I don't think you're overstating it. I think it changes all the time. And obviously, AI has been around for several decades. Generative AI is new and everybody's hair is on fire.
Right.
Right.
That's right.
So if you think about our our core literacy and training programs, we now have data and AI literacy as we think about programs that we bring to people. And so our 20 essentials of data literacy are now 25 essentials of data and AI literacy. We just finished a large engagement with a 100-year-old publishing company where we trained 7,000 of their workers on Gen AI. They're more sort of a Gen AI 101. They have their own internal chatbot. They want to make sure that they've got some, literate employees who are using it, how to use it. And so, everybody says, and we agree, there's no AI without data. And so, we are right in that sweet spot of helping organizations. We still do a lot of data training and data science training, but really with an AI lens on it right now. Because if you think about the C-suite, and especially the CDO, right, the CDO's hair is on fire right now. The CEO is like, what's our AI strategy? The board's asking me what our AI strategy is.
Right.
What do we do here? And so we're able to really be consultative with our clients and say, let's take half a step back. Let's understand where you are. Let's understand where you are from a core data strategy and data literacy perspective.
Hmm.
And then when you layer the AI lens on top of it, how can we help you?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. And I'll throw another observation at you and just get your opinion on this. I've been
Mhm.
tracking the data space obviously for a long time, since before DM radio. So we're talking, close to a quarter century now. And you could tell me I don't look that old, but I've been following it for a long
You don't
time.
look that old, Eric.
And thank you. One thing I noticed years ago, and it seems to be continuing, is that the data science world and the data management world, so think data science versus data warehousing, often don't talk to each other. And in large organizations, you'll have a data science team, you'll have a data warehouse team, and they're not even really friends. They collaborate very much. Have you seen that? Because I've always been perplexed by that. And I think that we're going to start seeing that change for a variety of reasons. I think it needs to change because obviously they both have aligned goals. They're both working for the business, and you would want trusted data for your data science, probably coming from a data warehouse. And you'd want to learn from the data science team if you're the data warehousing folks. But what have you seen out there? And is that something you focus on, trying to help organizations reconcile these groups and really stay focused on the business? What do you think?
It's a great question, and I think you've really honed in on something. As we think about working with our clients, and we look at it from a very data-centric lens. Take the x-axis, we look at as all the technology, right? The data warehouse, all the technology that you buy to make sure your data is clean and secure and accessible and everything you need from an infrastructure perspective. And then we look at the y-axis as data literacy, data fluency, data mastery, the data science and analysis there, right? You can have a company that's really good at the x-axis, has fantastic data, and no one really knows how to actually use it effectively.
Right.
And then you can have a whole bunch of highly trained data scientists and data analysts, right? And even a very literate non-technical workforce who knows how to use data, and they can't access it, and it's not clean, and they can't trust it. And so when those two things work together, we call it the V axis, which is value, right?
Hmm.
Business value. And so we really like to use that framing when we talk to clients. Like you can have fantastic technology and great data warehouse, right? But if you don't have anybody who knows how to use the data, it doesn't do you any good, right? And vice versa.
Yeah, that's encouraging. I love that you've already thought through that and you see it happening. I'm not alone in the world and
Right.
recognizing this because I've asked quite a few people on the show over the years, and they all nod their head like, "Yeah, that's what we see too." And I remember we did a show. Gosh, this is now 7 or 8 years ago, about chief data officer and should we have a chief data officer? And I went into the show thinking, no, we don't need another seat at the C-suite. And by the end of that show, I was like, wow, we need a chief data officer. So it's like
Yeah.
I'm willing to have my mind changed. And I think that, obviously too many cooks spoil the stew, so you have to be careful about that. But I do think that role of CDO and CAO, Chief Analytics Officer, and you're
Hmm.
starting to see more Chief AI officers. I
Right.
think it's important to have those people at the highest level of the business consulting with each other, maybe debating over which direction to go in certain circumstances. But it's important because they, to your point, they are crucial components of a successful business strategy these days. If you don't have an information strategy, you kind of don't have a business strategy. What do you think about that?
I think that's true. And I would actually say it's a culture strategy, right?
Mm,
It's not just the CDO. The CDO needs buy-in from the CEO and the CISO and the head of HR, chief learning officer, because at the end of the day, data is all about culture, right? And if
mm-hmm.
you've got the right sort of data literacy culture in your organization, you're going to find that V curve, if you will, in the middle between the technology and the people.
Yeah, I love the V curve, by the way. That's
Yeah.
outstanding. I really like this concept because you're realizing that you can do all the fundamentals right and still have the execution wrong and other fundamentals of data management and still
Yeah.
not know what to do with it. Or you could be very clever in how to work things, but the data management side isn't clean. I kind of view this whole Gen AI maelstrom as very effective in raising awareness about the need for good data quality and good data governance, because the last thing you want to do is turn some AI algorithm loose on your unstructured data if you don't know what's in there. You're going to get all kind of weird stuff coming out. I mean, I'll give you one of my favorite examples that, training an AI model is kind of like raising a kid. You have to be careful what you expose them to because they'll absorb whatever you send their way. So if you
That's
say
right.
curse words in front of your 2-year-old, don't be surprised if they say curse words back like 5 days later. It's like, where'd that come from? It came from you. It came from the
Exactly.
training. So it's like I think companies are figuring out, we have to clean up this mess, which is all this unstructured data that has all the context for the structured data, by the way. I mean, your structured data means nothing without the context of unstructured data. So
Hmm.
I think it's been a clarion call to clean up unstructured data and really kind of get that house in order. Is that what you're seeing?
I think we're definitely seeing it. And then we also see it as the people who are doing that work and the people who are recipients of that good work being done need to speak a common language, right, around data. So you can have, a group on the technology side and the
Right.
government governance side, making sure everything is exactly where you want it to be based on your playbook and your blueprint. But if you're not using the same language as the teams who are going to access it, you have a real problem. So we really think about data literacy. Obviously, data governance is part of it, security, but we like to take it back to a common language, right?
Mm,
We have a trademarked term called information as a second language, similar to English as a second language. How do we
interesting.
make sure everybody in the company who is talking about data and using data, which is everybody in a company in 2024, almost
Right.
2025, are speaking a common language so that they can do their jobs more effectively?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I'm a communicator by trade, and I sit around and think about this stuff all the time. And context is something that is almost invariably taken for granted. When you start talking to someone in the business, especially someone from a different part of your organization, far more often than not, people who are talking think or believe that the people who are hearing understand what they're saying. Like there's just this belief that everyone gets it all the time, which of course is not the
Mhm.
case. And in interpersonal communication, you can course correct very quickly. You can wait. Now, are you following? Are you getting this? Like, well, not really. Okay, let me dive deeper. So that's in person is very, very valuable. Whereas in writing, how could you tell? You can't tell. You have to hope that someone reads the rules and understands the rules.
Right?
So that in-person communication, that's very important. That's kind of what you're talking about with a second language as information for the organization. Is that about right?
Absolutely. And context is key. I mean, I lead a company, you're a communicator. If you don't set context to the message you're giving, 50% of it at least gets lost, right?
Right.
You can have all the right bullet points, but if they don't understand why you're putting the bullet points into your message, whether you're speaking or in PowerPoint or anything, then most of the communication isn't heard the way you want it to be.
Hmm. Yeah, it's important to listen a lot and to, obviously take notes and pay attention. One of the most amazing things I think about this Gen AI stuff, and you see it now with we use Read AI, there's Gong, there's Otter AI notes and all these other things that you can use to listen to your conversations, automatically transcribe them, and then give you bullet points of what was discussed in the meeting. That stuff is spectacular. I mean, it's so
It's great.
useful.
Because I will tell you, I'm not a great listener if I'm taking notes.
Yeah,
I feel like I probably lose 25 or 30% of what the other person or people are saying if I'm trying to furiously take notes. So I will, have a notebook ready and take a note or two just to sort of remind me of the conversation, but really not take a lot of detailed notes. Now I don't need that, right? There's plenty of note takers in all of my Zooms and Google Meets
it's
and
crazy.
everything. I don't have them face to face yet at the dinner table with my wife and kids, but we'll see.
Right. Well, they have that even that whole series of commercials of like throw the flag and I challenge you didn't tell me this. It's like,
Oh, that's
let's look at the
fantastic.
camera, and they're like, oh yeah, you did.
Yeah, that
And
is
that's
such a great ad campaign.
it's very clever, I have to say. It's very funny.
Yeah.
And it look at if you look at the business world, that's what we have with these things. And I think it's really good news all the way around, even though they're not perfect. They're close to perfect and they're good enough that you can catch what has been said and what has been discussed. And that's great for management because you talked about the 50% of that's lost if you're taking notes or if you're not setting the context properly. Well, now you have to set aside time to review them and to look back on it. But just knowing that it's there, I think helps keep people at the table and helps keep people open-minded and honest and telling the truth. Because, if someone doesn't do their job, it's a bit awkward for them to admit, well, I didn't do my job. So it's just nice to kind of have that baseline in the background. And that's thanks to Gen AI, right?
Well, I have a great example of it too. There are programs out there from a sales perspective that will tell you how optimistic or pessimistic
Right.
um, sandbagging a salesperson is, right? So
Right.
they will have a call with a client, come off and say, "Oh, we're 80%, they're going to buy this $500,000 software product." And the AI tool will tell you, "Well, actually, like it's probably closer to 30%, or vice versa, right?" And
Right.
so really interesting. Now, you have to take all of that with a grain of salt. You can't just sort of believe the AI, but how incredibly helpful is that for a CFO or a sales leader to understand whether or not your top salesperson is a sandbagger, right? And always says, "Hey, I'm going to come in at $2 million this month," and they come in at six, right? Or they say they're going to come in at six and they come in at two.
Right. And
Everybody
and the
tracks that data manually. You can now trade
right.
it based on phone calls and
Yeah.
listening to
That's
Zooms.
and
Unbelievable.
And that is business intelligence. That's the kind of stuff that we've been using these tools to do for years and years. Now you can do it on unstructured data and even conversations. Well, don't touch that dial, folks. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio. Eric Kavanagh here talking to Doug Llewellyn from the Data Society, and they help organizations figure out their data strategies and really get down to brass tacks and upskill their teams to use these technologies to get the most out of these technologies. And Doug, you talked a bit about data literacy, which is what the name would imply, understanding data, understanding what data means, how to use data, what is the context. There are general terms to understand, and there are very specific business terms to understand, like in a data catalog, for example. And data catalogs are a great way to improve data literacy because you're defining certain business terms, you're sharing that with the organization. We've done some work with a number of different data catalog vendors over the years. I think they're getting better and better. We could talk about that maybe later in the show, what I call new IT versus old IT. But let's
Mhm.
talk a bit about data literacy and maybe data catalogs and how important they are. What are your thoughts on how to improve data literacy in an organization? What have you seen?
Yeah, so the first company that Data Society Group acquired was a company called the Data Lodge, founded by a woman named Valerie Logan, who used to be at Gartner. And she has really pioneered data literacy programs and data literacy program management. And so when Val and the Data Lodge engage with a client, they really try to understand where that customer is in the journey of sort of data management, data governance, data catalogs, but really foundationally from a data literacy and culture perspective. And so usually there is a chief data officer who's sponsoring this. They will have a senior program, data literacy program lead, and then we'll come in and do a 10-week boot camp that is a train the trainer
Hmm.
around a whole set of common language, like I talked about earlier in the show, and how to really take sort of a culture change management program into your organization, right? These are usually thousands of employees, if not tens of thousands of employees, and they will put one or two people into a cohort with other customers of ours. We usually have three or four companies in a cohort. We'll do custom boot camps. We had one Fortune 500 company put 17 people into, a custom boot camp. But we really think about it at that core foundational common language framework, right? As I talked about earlier, we have 25 essentials of data literacy and AI literacy. And we walk you through that before we even get to skills training, right? So it is cultural change management. It is a boot camp, a train the trainer model so that that culture can be permeated throughout the organization. And there's data governance sections of it, data cataloging, there's technology. We obviously talk about all the different companies that are out there that can help train your employees. There's many different modalities. We own a company, Data Society, where the name came from, that does instructor-based training. We're big believers that employees and students and learners learn a lot better in sort of cohort instructor-based training than asynchronous. Not that asynchronous, sort of online only, doesn't have a place in the world, right? But from a complementary perspective, we really focus on the instructor-based training. And so our data literacy programs are very thorough, incredibly intensive, and really allow for those companies to then go in and take their organizations to the next level around their employee sets.
Yeah, that sounds great. And one thing I've noticed in the last last several years is that data governance is now a very hot topic, and it's very important. We kind of hinted at this in the opening segment. I think AI and Gen AI has something to do with that. But we
Hmm.
figure 20 years ago, you couldn't really do data governance. You could control data access at the database level or perhaps in an application somehow. And that's a very difficult thing to manage, especially at scale. But now we really can do data governance. I think the cloud is a big part of that because in cloud computing, you have all of this metadata and functionality baked into the environment. And I've studied service-oriented architecture, for example, 20 odd years ago. And even though SOA isn't really talked about very much anymore, I think the principles of SOA really were infused into cloud architectures. And so now you can tell who has logged into the system when, what data did they touch. All that is now possible. I think that's another reason why data governance is prominent now, because you can actually pull it off programmatically. What do you think?
I think that's true, and I certainly think it's prominent because of what we talked about earlier, this rise of Gen AI and how dynamic everything is. There is a bit of a fear of if we don't have our data governance right around Gen AI, we've got real problems. And so I think the technologies allow for it, and I think the where the market is going just shows there's such a big need for it.
Hmm. RAG models. Are you doing any courses or classes when you talk about governance? Do you talk about RAG models at all?
We do. We do absolutely because governance both we've got data governance as part of our data literacy boot camps, and we also have data governance as specific training, sort of cohort-based training in the data society catalog and curriculum.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I've had this theory going for a while now since this AI stuff took off that, really these engines, these large language models and foundational models, they're so powerful. You're a bit of a fool to just ignore them or to think that you can not deal with it at all. And I think that probably many technology companies, as well as end user companies, are going to have to figure out where they're going to fit in this new world. How are you going to leverage what you've built and use for impact in this new world in which large language models will be a very significant component part. And so I think software companies and end user companies really need to think about this and understand how they're going to fit into this new sort of de facto architecture. And I think it is about as big a deal as Kubernetes was, because if you look at Kubernetes coming along, and I remember I tell the story of MapR, which got absorbed by I think it was HP or someone. But MapR was the third big data company to come along and focus on this Hadoop stuff. You had Cloudera and then Hortonworks, and then MapR came along. And like around the 2016, 2017 timeframe, maybe I took a briefing from them and they told me they were refactoring their entire stack to run on Kubernetes. And I thought to myself, this is a data platform company. if they're refactoring their entire technology to run in Kubernetes, like this is the way of the future. And we've now seen that containerization is huge. Most of the major vendors are going down that path. They're leveraging Kubernetes. And I think that this transformation with Gen AI and these foundational models is of that caliber that we're going to have to figure out how to refactor in that new world. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's true. And who knows where it's going to end up? I think we saw a year ago, 15 months ago, everything was open, huge data sets, everybody sort of putting their data in. I think we're quickly seeing it closing
Hmm.
now, right? And so, I mean, think about healthcare companies, like they're not going to have like, oh yeah, let's just put our data in any sort of large model. Like that's just, there's no way they could do it. But 15 months ago, everybody was like, put all the data in, train the models, do it, and so it'll be really interesting to see where that balance shakes out, right? Because, the larger data sets you have, the more you can train, the more and better you can train ostensibly, right? But the smaller, the tighter it is. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see sort of where that ends up and then what technologies and sort of um, actually follow it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I do think there are going to be a couple big tracks here going forward because, as we've said, data management typically is deterministic. I want to make sure I get the accurate data from this system at this point in my workflow to enable a transaction of some kind. The Gen AI stuff is much different. It is generative, it's probabilistic, so it's not always going to be accurate, but they are pretty darn good. I mean, for anything that has
They're
been
really good.
widely published about, and I try to remind people these LLMs in particular are consensus engines because they've been trained on tons and tons of data. And whatever topic has been very widely published about, they're going to be pretty good. How do transistors work? How does a refrigerator work? All that kind of stuff is going to be pretty accurate. Now, for the fringe stuff, not so much because there's not enough training in there. But for that stuff, it's going to be good. So I think you're going to have these two tracks running, and we're going to be trying to bring them together, almost
Yeah.
like the data management and data science stuff. It's like, come on, guys, like let's try to focus in, and that's the kind of challenge that your organization, I think, is uniquely suited to help with, right?
Absolutely. And, we do a lot of really practical sort of capstone project-like based training with the data, the proprietary data of the company itself. So it's not just theoretical. So obviously, companies who can use their own data in the training and have their people manipulating it in the training, it's going to be more effective. Obviously, with the general public and consumers who are using ChatGPT or Gemini, right? They're going to find a lot of effective, accurate outputs, if you will, of the large, non-proprietary data sets that don't matter. Like I'll give you an example. 6 months ago, I was writing a job description, for something, and I consider myself a pretty good writer. I wrote it. I didn't like it. So I Googled a job description of a similar title, and I found something that was, a little bit better, right? And then I just asked, I guess it was Bard back then, to do it. Perfect, right? Just
Wow.
because it had access to so much more than one, just my brain, and then two, all the different stuff that had been cataloged and indexed in the Google search engine, right? And it just spit it out. I was like, I went from mediocre to good to great in,
Wow.
took me probably 45 minutes to write it, took me a minute and 45 seconds for the Google search, and it took, 15 seconds for um, Bard to do it.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
It really is crazy when you think about it. And I think that governance in that space is going to be real important. And I think the key to remember with these engines, with these consensus engines, is that they're great for getting you maybe 80% of the way there. Or and interesting, it's in your particular use case, it got you the last mile, which is interesting. I think
Yeah.
usually it's good for getting your product almost there. And even in
Right.
coding, this is what I'm hearing from all the coders I know. They say it is very good at giving you a basic like 80% of what you need to get some function done. And then you have to go in and fine tune the 20%. Well, that's going to save you a lot of time from having to start from scratch every time. They say, no, why rebuild the wheel, right? Why redesign the wheel when it's already out there? So this Copilot stuff, I think, is going to be tremendously powerful in accelerating innovation within companies. What do you think?
Absolutely. We were on a Zoom with the different portfolio companies from our investors all about how different companies are using AI. And our chief technology officer and CDO got on and talked about that exact thing of how much more efficient, doesn't do the whole job for you, but how much more efficient his team can now be with these coding assistants, right? He said, doesn't do everything. There's certain languages where it's better than others. But at the end of the day, he said, we've seen massive gains in productivity and quality when it is that human and machine combination, right? I was at
Hmm.
the CDO IQ event in Boston over the summer, and there
Yeah, I
was a
was there
woman.
too.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Sorry, I
might
didn't.
have might have bumped shoulders with you
We might
somewhere.
have bumped shoulders, but there's a woman from MIT who was on a couple of different panels, really talking about the future is about that, AI machine and human connection, right? It's not one or the other. And you hear all these people in sort of the general sort of news stories talking about, is AI going to replace employees? And I think the answer in my mind, in our mind, is we think about serving our customers best is that employees trained in AI are going to replace employees who aren't. It's not
Right.
the AI who's going to replace the employees.
That's right. I think that's exactly correct. And I think much of the value that AI brings will come through the power of suggestion. AI will be monitoring your behavior in the background. It'll throw out a sec, hey, do you want to look at this? Do you want to look at that? Consider this, consider that. And I think it's very powerful because it's still the human deciding. And this
Mhm.
is again, it's not terribly new. There was a company, oh gosh, what were they called? I can't remember their name now, but they did some very, very neat work where they were sitting on top of your Gmail. I mean, Google itself does this now, and they'll recommend, hey, do you want to follow up on this email or on that email? And what they do is they spin up a whole list of suggestions such that the salesperson starts their day with 10 or 15 recommendations on whom to contact, and a
Yeah.
lot of times, you will not have thought of several of them like, "Wow, yeah, I forgot about that guy." And that's tremendous value to remind people of what they should be working on. What do you think?
Well, think about that example exactly. Salespeople are usually really good at selling, interacting with people, storytelling, conveying value, etc. They're not great at setting up reminders in their calendars, do all that
Right.
stuff. I mean, when you think about Salesforce as this massively successful multi-billion dollar company, right? It asks people who don't necessarily thrive in environments where you have to be really detail oriented to put a whole bunch of data into detail oriented, I would say not that great of a user interface, right?
Right.
And so
Right.
if AI can now do 80% of that for a salesperson, they can spend
That's
more
it.
time doing what they do best, which is
That's
selling.
it. That's it. And get even real-time suggestions. I mean, that's the cool thing is you think about customer service, for example, at a call center somewhere. If you have a good architecture now where you can tap into these various sources of information, you could be feeding that customer service rep good tips and good advice and good information while they're on the call. And that's when you want them to get the good information is while they're on the call. So
Yeah.
it's like this whole new wave of innovation is touching every shore. I mean, it's all over the darn place. And the sooner you figure out like how you're going to adjust your workflow to leverage it, I think the better off you're going to be. But folks, will be right back talking to Doug Llewellyn of the Data Society. Don't touch that dial. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio with a fantastic conversation with Doug Llewellyn. He's the CEO of the Data Society. They have bought four companies, and they're really focused on training in the data and AI space to help organizations upskill and leverage these technologies and do cool things with them. And, Doug, I wrote about a topic when I was going to the Boomi conference, I don't know, maybe 5, 6 months ago, that really struck me because I was thinking about the power of these large language models, the generative capability that they have to articulate concepts in English or any language, really almost any language, and how powerful that is and how compelling it is. And also thinking about information architecture, which has been a hot topic for our audience for the entirety of this show. A lot of people really think about what does it mean to have a good information architecture, and there's a lot that goes into that. Well, now these vector databases and large language models are a big part of your information sharing architecture, if you will, and consumption architecture. And I had this idea, I call it the executive cockpit, where I think forward-looking companies are going to take a small language model, for example, or they'll just leverage ChatGPT or Gemini in a slightly different architecture with a RAG model or something. But ideally, in my mind, you get a small language model that you host in your data center, and I know companies that are doing this, and you train it on all of your data, your customer data, your communications, you train it on support tickets, on CRM, on ERP, everything you got, even security, reading, if you have Splunk, for example, all the log files. Let's look at all that stuff. Just get it all in there. Then you're going to set up Kafka topics from your main sources, your main information systems into a vector database. And that's part of a sort of RAG model that is the executive cockpit. And then the senior executives can just sit there all day and ask questions like, how are we to achieving goals in our marketing programs for the Southeast region? What can we do to improve this? If we need to scale back, who can we cut or what can we do? And just get all these answers in real time from this system. And the way this changes everything is that now when the senior executives have meetings with their teams, they're not just waiting for their teams to tell them what's happening. They can just tap in and find out themselves what's happening and say, okay, what do you think about this thing that's happening or that thing that's happening? I think that is going to dramatically change how we manage complex organizations. And it's going to expedite solutions and really foster much more productive conversations in the organization. But what do you think about that?
Well, I don't think I leave my desk, right? So there's that problem right there because I would be so intrigued, but
Right. That's
just to
funny.
do it. I mean, I
Good
have
answer.
I'm not allowed into all of our dashboards because sometimes I look at the data and ask too many questions. Like I
Right,
Slack
sure.
people like, it's 11:05. What happened here? Like, oh my gosh, Doug, stop. So I
That's
mean, I
funny.
think it will be hard for a lot of people in the organization. If there's an executive cockpit like you just described that is giving people real-time information based on what questions real-time are popping into their heads, there's
Mhm.
going to be a lot of SVPs and VPs and directors in the organization who are like, we got to turn that off, right? Because we can't react fast enough to it. So
That's funny.
ultimately, I think it's incredibly valuable because it just allows you to be that much more nimble in running your business, right?
Mhm.
And so when you think about the basic reporting now of KPIs or OKRs or rocks and EOS or whatever it is, it's a pretty structured linear process of how to sort of gather the data, measure the data, report on the data. If there is a real-time cockpit where, just asking a very simple question can give you those insights, it's incredibly helpful for the business, but it's going to change the way people work every day. So it's not
Right.
just additive, it's additive and disruptive. And companies, what I call operational culture, is going to need to adapt to it.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you're right. You made a couple really good points that I hadn't even fully thought through, and you're probably right on point that there would be a bit of a rebellion against this.
Yeah.
But it's again like if you can see that level of granularity, because there's such a gray area between what the CEO sees in his or her day-to-day workflow and what's happening on the front lines. And I guess what I'm suggesting here is that's kind of going away. And there will be
Mhm.
downsides of that going away, and there will be upsides of that going away. And I think the upside is like as long as the executive has the patience to recognize that you can't change the whole organization, in one fell swoop, it's going to be good to better understand. Because the other thing I like, and you probably agree with this, is that empathy is hugely important in organizations,
Mhm.
and empathy between groups. I remember learning in a class, the kind of which that you teach, some 20 odd years ago, that usually the communication problems aren't from the top down or from the bottom up. They're across the organization. They're across the directors or the VPs in different departments, and they just don't talk very often. And they should talk more to understand what they're doing and talk more in scenarios where they're not on the spot or where they're not feeling they have to be defensive about something. I think that's one of the real crucial success factors for organizations is that cross-organizational communication, right?
I agree totally. And I think it's a lot harder than it was a decade ago because so
Mm,
many people work virtually. They're not in offices
right.
and they're not running into, person from department A isn't running into person from department B walking to lunch or at the coffee station when everything has to be scheduled through Google Enterprise or Outlook or, on Slack, hey, Eric, can I chat with you for 5 minutes? It's harder to have that cross-department empathy like you talked about
Mm,
because people aren't building relationships. The communication's a lot more transactional. And
mm.
so I was actually on a podcast a few weeks ago where I talked about, I think it's one of the biggest challenges of our workforce is how people communicate with each other, asynchronously all the time. And think about 22 and 23-year-old kids graduating from college and they're doing their orientation days at their kitchen table in their apartment with three roommates who are doing the same thing, as opposed
Right.
to walking in and observing how people work. And I think it's a real challenge.
Yeah, I think you make an excellent point that we are still in this very disruptive, turbulent time. And the other side of the equation, of course, is that you have all these generations now involved, right? I mean, you've got
Hmm.
octogenarians, 70-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 50-year-olds, all the way down to 20-year-olds, and the generational shifts between each environment are significant. And finding someone who can manage all those generations, that's a pretty difficult thing to do. Is that something that you help people kind of figure out and sort through with some of your training?
We do it in our what I call our change management program. So the data literacy boot camps are really about change management, and it's a train the trainer. So we really talk about that from a context and community and common language perspective. A lot of our trainings, which are downstream from that cultural change management programming we do, are a lot more sort of skill specific. But as we see what skills are needed and then the broader context of what you just talked about, my guess is that we will actually layer a lot of that into the curriculum, over the next year or two.
Yeah, and I love that train the trainer mentality because that's what you're doing. I mean, you're not like consultants who are going in and standing up a data warehouse. No, you're consultants going in, helping people understand how to set up a data warehouse, how to work that into an overall information strategy. And I guess maybe
Hmm.
we'll talk about that too in the podcast bonus segment. I feel that every organization should have an information strategy and probably even an information strategy group. It doesn't have to be a big group of people, but if you're a Fortune 500 company, it probably should be a 10 or 15 person group because things are changing so fast and because there are regulations to pay attention to, new technologies to understand, new ways of using technology to understand. But I think that information strategy component should be a central part of almost any organization today. What do you think?
I agree 100%. If you think about when I was in college, I read a book in one of my classes called Why Nations Go to War. And 90% of war started because of miscommunication between leaders.
Right. Right.
Right. And so think about if internally you're able to communicate much more effectively and externally with your customers, you're going to be able to communicate much more effectively, how much better of a business you have
Hmm.
and how
Yeah, it's
much better
that
of an economy we have, right? There's sort of the
right.
macro and the micro. There's the micro inside our business, and there's the macro of if everybody had this information strategy group, right, that had all the things that we've talked about in this entire interview, right, working together effectively, we have businesses that are performing that much better, and then our economy is going to perform that much better.
Yeah, I have to agree with that 100%. And I think that's very valuable. And I think that I'll throw one of my other theories at you when we come back
Yeah,
for the podcast bonus segment. But
great.
the power of these language models to educate people on the fly about things is really quite compelling. It's like a dynamic pop-up Encyclopedia Britannica on almost any subject, understanding that they do make mistakes, so you have to watch out for some of the factual things that they throw at you. But in terms of concepts and understanding concepts, it's deep. I mean, this stuff goes deep, and so that's gonna be very disruptive, and it's gonna be very useful for people who focus on using that technology, understanding it, and not being afraid of it. But folks, podcast bonus segment is coming up next. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here for the podcast bonus segment on a fantastic DM radio. Eric Kavanagh talking to Doug Llewellyn, CEO of the Data Society. And Doug, I have this theory I've come up with just the other night. It popped into my head that the age of the individual blowhard is coming to an end. And what I mean by that is in lots of organizations and companies and governments and even in like groups of friends and families, you get this individual blowhard who just causes trouble. And they either stymie progress or they're a wet blanket or they're just not doing what they're supposed to be doing or they're just too much to deal with. And I think that's ending for lots of different reasons. And AI has a lot to do with it because I think executives and teams are going to be much more quickly able to figure out what's going wrong, especially just by asking these systems. If you have, the sensors in place, if you will, the instrumentation to really understand who's doing what in your business, I think it's going to become harder and harder to be that one stick in the mud that stands in the way, both in terms of execution, but also in terms of knowledge. Because a lot of times the blowhard knows something and other people don't know what that person knows. And they're like, well, we need to go to this person to get this piece of information. And I think that's going to be fading because of these new models and because of awareness of what you can see happening in your organization. But what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's also people think the blowhard might know things. So I
Right.
think,
That's
if
true
you
too.
talk about the executive cockpit, like we talked about in the last segment, like that is the ultimate BS meter that sort
Oh,
of, puts the blowhard back on their heels.
right. That's right.
And so sort of put those two concepts together, I think you're exactly right. Like you don't need to have to go through that person, or you don't need to have to deal with that person if they're very forward with all of their opinions
Right.
about the knowledge. And so, I think your theory is spot on.
Well, and I think something else is going to happen here, which is very, very, very interesting. And my namesake, the company is the Bloor Group, and Dr. Robin Bloor is my partner. He's mostly retired now, but he threw out this idea, gosh, probably 10 or 12 years ago. And at the time, I thought like that's not going to happen. But now when I think about it, I'm like, huh, there could be something to this that you're going to have AI playing a stronger and stronger role in running organizations, in setting targets, in managing things just through suggestions and reminders and things of this nature. But and what I think is going to happen is you're going to have a more of a federated control of organizations. And that's probably going to be a good thing. So if you think about a big company, when it goes wrong, it's usually because someone at the top just didn't listen, didn't understand the threats, or didn't see something coming, or couldn't do change management fast enough. There are lots and lots of examples of this throughout the years. But I do think that organizational hierarchies are going to be flatter, and you're going to have a much more federated operational nature to them where directors will be free to do more things. They won't be hog-tied by people above them approving or not approving of certain things. I get the sense this is coming, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts because it comes into all sorts of discussions around organizational structures and roles and responsibilities and who can do what and all that fun stuff. But I think that companies are going to be smaller, leaner, and flatter, and you're going to have more autonomy in smaller groups around the organization. What do you think?
I think they'll be smaller and leaner, and maybe they'll be flatter. I'm not sure I'm totally there yet. Um, I think what AI is going to allow us to do is have more confidence in our assumptions,
Hmm,
right? And then probably more confidence in our people to go out and be more autonomous and do things and create more value on their own. I think at the end of the day, though, we also need to understand how to put together organizations that have the right guardrails.
right,
And because if you don't have the right guardrails, you're going to have problems. And
right.
so, whether that means that the organization stays hierarchical or not, I'm not sure. But I think from a governance and a guardrail perspective, let's give a wide berth, but let's really understand where those boundaries are. Because if you don't
Mhm.
do that well, and that happens at the micro level inside companies, and it happens at the macro level from a policy perspective. I mean, you probably read we just bought the company Inspired Minds, who's a large AI community with really fascinating information sharing that happens sort of at the highest levels of AI and AI policy and so I think guardrails are going to be really important inside of companies, probably more so than they ever have been.
Yeah, that's probably true, and those are really good points. And I'm also reminded that you do have to watch out for automation, because automation goes wrong. I've seen on my smartphone, for example, or on some of these apps. I mean, they'll, "Oh, are you trying to do this?" "No, I'm not." "Oh, are you trying to?" "No, I'm not."
Yeah.
Like, "Would you stop with your recommendations? That is you've not
Yeah.
been correct yet." So it's like and it's hard because everything moves so fast. I mean, that's the challenge. It's like, well, how do we input little guardrails in this task or that task? It's not immediately apparent for many of the more challenging functions of the business. So, it's like this is constant changing nature that we have to deal with. I don't envy the modern CIO. I have to tell you, I
Yeah,
think these
I'm
folks
with
have a
you.
tremendous amount to worry about every day. Well, closing thoughts, where should someone go to find out? You have some events coming up. Where can people learn more about the Data Society?
Yeah, so if you go to cdomagazine.tech, we have our whole slate of events. Everything from mid-size to large-size summits, all talking about data strategies, AI strategies, throughout the year. And then Inspired Minds, has a slate of global events. You go to inspiredminds.co.uk and find out. And then datasocietygroup.com, will tell you more about what we do overall in terms of serving, the chief data officers and chief learning officers on both sides of what they do, the culture change management and workforce development, as well as the platforms and communities.
Sounds good. Well, look this gentleman up online, Doug Llewellyn of the Data Society. He just referenced cdomagazine.tech. I just looked it up myself. Lots of great content there. Looks real slick, looks good. And I think you're doing great work. And this is the kind of work we need. I mean, it's a very bold future that we face. And I think the sooner organizations dive in and really try to upskill their team, the better off everyone's going to be. There are a lot of challenges ahead. Watch out for the probabilistic nature of Gen AI. It's always going to have some issues with clarity and accuracy, but of course, so do people. But if you want to be
Yeah.
in the show, send me an email, info@dmradio.biz. We're building out the EdCal for next year right now. So we'll talk to you later, folks. You've been listening to DM Radio.